To Jazakumullah khairan, Brother Ahsan. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen. Wassalatu wassalamu ala ashrafil mursaleen. Sayyidina wa biyana wa maulana Muhammadin ajma'een. Rabbi shrah li sadri wa yassir li amri wa hlul uqdatan min lisani yafqahu qawli. So, Alhamdulillah, last week we had our first session, which Maulana Ibrahim and Maulana Hasim Fatih basically just covered around the importance, the objective of zakah. And today we'll be covering a little bit more of the technical aspect, which is around the calculation. But before I start, I just wanted to cover just in terms of the previous session, which is quite important before I actually continue, is that of the framework of zakah. So we mentioned 4 conditions that had to be present before zakah is due on anyone's wealth. The first of that conditions, and I'm not going to go into it too detailed because you can watch the recording of the previous session, is that of ownership, which means that you only pay zakah on wealth that absolutely belongs to you. Secondly, the second condition that has to be met is that of growth, which means that the wealth that you own must grow or have potential to grow. And then the third condition which has to be present is that of nisab. So nisab is that minimum surplus net zakatable wealth that you need to possess. And the fourth condition is that this nisab needs to be held for 1 Islamic calendar year, which is what we call whole. So these are the 4 conditions that must be present before you even start determining whether your zakatable, the wealth that you have is zakatable. The only thing I maybe just wanted to clarify is the condition of whole, because sometimes people get a little bit confused with this condition, and I thought let me just take a minute or two just to clarify this. So here we have a practical example, and I don't think Maulana Ibrahim last week went through this example. So here we have an individual who has managed to put some funds away, so he's got some surplus wealth. And the nisab, remember I said, is that minimum surplus that you need to possess is, let's assume it's 10,000 Rand. So the very first time this person held nisab is in Shaban. So this is now his or her anniversary date, which means you need to document this date because it's quite important when this date has occurred for the very first time. So let's say it's the 1st of Shaban. You now need to document this because every year on the 1st of Shaban, you will have to do your zakah valuation or your zakah calculation. So now this person has managed to reach nisab. At this point, if they've never paid zakah before, no zakah is due on their wealth because they've not held the 4th condition, which is that condition of whole. They met the first 3, they've reached the nisab, but all 4 of these conditions must be present. So at this point on the 1st of Shaban, this is only a determination to say that now this person may be liable for zakah after 1 Islamic calendar year. So now let's continue. So in Ramadan, they managed to save 5,000, in Shawwal. So here they managed to save, as we go along, you can see it's 30,000, 35,000. And during the year, they may have received, let's say, 10,000 dividends per quarter. And in the last, I just want to minimize the screen because now I can't see my full screen. And in the last year of Rajab, you see that this person has managed to save 200,000. But just 2 months or 3 months before that, they managed to save, or not save, they received 100,000 Rand inheritance. So my question is, how much will this person pay on the wealth that they have? Because remember, if you look at the end of Rajab, which is the very first day on the 1st of Shaban again, this person managed to have saved 200,000. So on what will they pay? If nobody knows the answer, or if I don't know if they can respond, they will have to pay on the complete amount of wealth that they have on the day of their calculation date, which means that they will have to pay, if I touch this thing, they will have to pay on the 200,000. It's not the wealth that needs to be held for 1 Islamic calendar year. It's the nisab. And this is the confusion that most people go through, in that they think, okay, because they only received 100,000, that 100,000 must lay for 1 Islamic calendar year, which is not correct. Because if that had to be the case, imagine you had to save, you had to go for each amount that you've had, 10,000, 5,000, 10,000, which is very impractical. So the most common solution and the practical solution that we advise everybody is that the condition that needs to be met is the condition of whole, of the nisab, not of the wealth. So you have to pay on the 200,000, which means 5,000 is due on the 2.5%. assuming you've got no other wealth. You've just got cash in the bank. Because if you had any other wealth, you'd have to add all your other wealth to it. So let's now start getting into the actual calculation of zakah. So here it's just important to note that, remember, Maulana Ibrahim or Maulana Asim has mentioned that we get our guidance from Quran and Sunnah. However, there are difference of opinion, so we have different madahib guiding us on the different practices. So I suggest if you're not sure about something, go to your nearest ulama, to your scholar, to your mufti or sheikh, and they can just guide you on that matter as well. Just also note that it's important why you're acquiring this asset. So your intention of when you're purchasing something is important because it can determine whether this wealth is zakatable or not zakatable. I don't know if I maybe should just give you an example quickly. So if, for example, you hold gold and your intention for this gold is that you actually want to keep it, let's say, for your daughter or for a gift for your wife, for example, but you're just holding it. Irrespective of your intention, gold in itself is zakatable. So if you look at the intention, now the intention doesn't matter because the wealth that you're holding is zakatable in itself. But always, if you look at most other assets, if you're purchasing, let's say a motor vehicle, if you're purchasing it with the intention of acquiring it for personal use, then that may not be zakatable. Then that wealth may not be zakatable. So just take note of your intention. So, alhamdulillah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is most merciful, and we're going to cover some of those wealth that we may possess that is not zakatable. So the first of these assets that is not zakatable is that of personal assets. So these are assets that you consume for your personal needs and necessities, like your residential property, your motor vehicles, your paintings, electrical appliance, etc., irrespective of the value. So if you may own a residential property, let's say worth $150,000, and let's say Brother Akhsan owns a property of, let's say, $50,000, both are not zakatable. So irrespective of the value, because it's a personal asset, it's not zakatable. So another asset that's not classified as zakatable assets are those capital assets and tools of trade. So capital assets is where you purchase an asset which may not be zakatable or is not zakatable. So say, for example, you're purchasing property. So the property building, because it's a capital asset, your intention is for long-term holding or for appreciation in value, that would not be zakatable. What may be zakatable or is zakatable is the rental income if you have it in your possession. But what I need you to understand is the capital asset that you're holding is not zakatable. The other one is tools of trade. So anything you purchase in the production of income, any infrastructure like your computers, your delivery vehicles, your office building, all of those assets are not zakatable because they're used in the production of income. What will be zakatable is obviously the profits that will be in the bank account at the end of the day. Those would then result in zakah. So any asset that you don't own, because remember one of the conditions which I mentioned, the first one is you only pay zakah on wealth that absolutely belongs to you. So if you have borrowed wealth, then you don't pay zakah on that because technically you're not the owner. Anything that's waqf, the masjid, anything that you're holding that is that's basically owned by the public, because nobody owns the masjid. You don't pay zakah on any of that wealth. And neither, for example, I'm a trustee at SANZAF. I may have a responsibility of a mandate of ensuring, the assets are protected, etc. But those assets, they don't belong to me. So I just have a governance oversight on that wealth. So it doesn't belong to me. So those are the assets for which you do not own, where there's no zakah on them. So certain metals and stones. So if you look at, for example, any metal other than gold and silver, so like your palladium, platinum, etc., those are not zakatable. If you look at stones, your diamonds, your gems, etc., those are not zakatable. And then lastly, we look at any wealth that is unlawful. So these are the wealth that we're referring to specifically, like interest, gambling, and stolen wealth. Included in this wealth that we say that is unlawful is anything that is non-Sharia compliant. So just to clarify that zakah does not purify unlawful wealth. The Prophet ﷺ said that he who acquires wealth by forbidden means, then gives it away as sadaqah, gets no reward, the sin remains on him. And here in terms of sadaqah, we're referring to as the charity, the zakah in the charity that is giving. And also just to remind that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does not accept sadaqah without, at least out of unlawful taken wealth, like the interest, etc. The same as he doesn't accept prayer with ablution. So that's just to note all these non-zakatable assets. Just to tell you in terms of where we get the 2.5%, because many people maybe just want to understand. So this is not something that any Sheikh or Mufti or Maulana has decided. This is the guidance of the Prophet ﷺ, where he said, pay a 40th. And if you take 1 divided by 40, you get 2.5%. And at another time, he said, if you have 200 dirhams, which is the nisab, pay 5. So if you take 5 divided by 200, gives you the 2.5%. So that's just to give you some guidance as to where we get the 2.5%. So these are the various categories of zakatable assets, and zakah is paid on all of these zakatable assets. So not just on liquid assets or not just on livestock. These are the various categories or classes of assets of which zakah is levied on. And each of these categories represent the various assets that the Sharia considers a form of wealth, which we say mal. And each has its own hold, has its own nisab and its own rate. However, I may just want to say very briefly, we'll only be covering liquid assets in this session today, because that's the common wealth that the ordinary person has on the street. We also get livestock, which is obviously the sheep, the cows, the camels, etc. And this is at 5% and has its different whole, and obviously depending on the type of sheep. Then we have agricultural products like the wheat, barley, etc. This is between 5 and 10%. Obviously, if you just use rain, it's 5. If you have an irrigation system, it's 10%, and at harvest. And then lastly, minerals. So this is usually at extraction, about 20%. But this is just to tell you of the various classes of assets that you have. So depending on the asset that you have, you will pay the rate and you apply the whole according to that asset. So, like I said, today we will just be covering the assets on relating to liquid assets. So this is a formula that I just need everybody to remember, because this is the formula that you will need to be able to determine and calculate your zakah. So you take all your zakatable assets. Remember, I just had in the previous slide, I mentioned whether you have, but we're only going to mention the liquid assets today. So you add all your zakatable assets, and we'll get through them in the next slide, which is your, let's say, your investments, your cash, your retirement annuity, gold and silver, all your zakatable assets, less certain liabilities that you're allowed to deduct, and we'll obviously go through that, will give you your net zakatable assets. So we say net because net is less liabilities. You take your net zakatable assets, and now you times it by that 2.5%, and that will give you your zakah that's payable. So this is the formula that you will need to use when you're doing your calculation. So let's speak about the liquid assets that we're going to cover today. So we're going to cover money, we're going to cover investments, some receivables, debtors, policies, some retirement savings, pension, provident and retirement annuities. We'll cover gold and silver, digital assets and business assets. So let's get straight into our liquid assets. Money, so zakah on money. So in Surah Tawbah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in verse 34 says that those who hoard gold and silver and do not spend in the way of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, give them glad tidings of a painful punishment. Maulana Hashim last week in the previous session elaborated on the punishment of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala when one does not fulfill this pillar of Islam. So I just want to remind everybody that it's important that you not just have the intention of paying, but you also need to ensure that you do the right calculation. And that's why, alhamdulillah, we're having these sessions today. So zakah on money includes all forms of cash and cash equivalents. So it's all your savings, your check accounts, fixed deposits, long-term investments, even if they're locked in. Many times I've been told that, you know, the investment is locked in a 3-year deposit, and you don't pay zakah on it until it's released. Remember, you made that intention to lock it in. So if you didn't lock it in and you actually had it in your bank account, you would have paid zakah on it. So the fact that you've locked it in does not relieve you of that zakah that's due on it. Always just remember that zakah isn't due on unlawful wealth. So if it's in a non-Sharia compliant bank account, you have to remove any interest that's in this bank account. Zakah on investments, which we usually will cover in terms of shares, listed as well as unlisted, as well as employee share schemes. So listed shares are similar to unit trusts and are as good as cash in the hands of the owner and are thus subject to zakah. Technically, you actually own a portion of the zakatable assets in those companies. So remember, if you look at companies, generally you'll have, if anybody knows in terms of the balance sheet, you'll have current assets, you'll have long-term assets, and you have liabilities. Current assets could be debtors, bank cash and cash equivalents, receivables, stock. In your long-term fixed assets, you could have investments, you could have different kind of longer-term assets that you hold, etc. Could be, I'm looking for something that's now kind of abstract, that's not physical, goodwill, for example. Not all assets are zakatable. You only pay zakah, or zakah is only levied on zakatable assets that you own in that company. So technically, you're supposed to determine what the zakatable assets are and your portion of that number of shares. So that's technically how you're meant to calculate. However, it's not always possible. So what most scholars say is take the market value of the listed share. Because those financial statements may come out, let's say, end of February. However, your calculation or valuation date could be 1st of Ramadan, which would be possibly in November. So the dates don't always coincide. So what most scholars say, just take the market value of those shares. When it comes to private shares, these are generally not listed shares, and the same rule would apply, but this is a bit easier to determine because unlisted shares, you can usually get the balance sheet from or management accounts from the shareholding, or from management, and you can then determine what those zakatable assets are, and you normally calculate your portion of those zakatable assets. When you speak about employee share schemes, so this is where companies, for example, want to retain good staff. I don't think anybody want to give an employee share scheme benefit to anybody that is not good staff. But having said that, if there are any conditions attached to these employee share schemes, so say, for example, the condition is once you've worked for this company for 5 years, you will now receive, let's say, 1,000 shares. If you're in your 3rd year of employment, you obviously have no right to those shares, which means you're not entitled to it, you do not own it, and hence you do not pay zakah on it. Only when you actually become the owner of that share will you be liable to pay zakah on those shares. But until there are conditions attached to it and those conditions have not been fulfilled, you technically do not own that wealth and no zakah is due on that. So let's speak about receivables or debtors. So zakah is payable on amounts owed to you if the debtor is sound and able to pay. And here we've split between debtors on non-zakatable assets and debtors on zakatable assets. So, for example, if you look at debtors from non-zakatable assets, if you sell your motor vehicle, and in the very next slide, we'll speak about, in fact, the previous slide, we just spoke about those not zakatable assets. And remember, your private motor vehicle is a non-zakatable asset. So if you're selling your motor vehicle or you've just sold it and you haven't received the money from the payment of that motor vehicle yet, that is a debtor on a non-zakatable asset. If the debtor is still outstanding on the day you're doing your calculation, let's assume it's today, then no zakah is due on that wealth. If, however, we're referring to the next category of debtors on zakatable assets, so this is, for example, where you've loaned money as in terms of the cash business. Maybe just to go back to non-zakatable assets. When you look at cash, for example, remember, we'll get to the category of where, in fact, we just did before. the money part. People may think that, the money is the intention of not using in terms of business, but if it's as long as you're holding it, irrespective of the intention, cash is still zakatable. So if there's a debtor, if you receive that cash immediately the day before your zakah valuation date, then the color of the wealth has changed to a zakatable asset and not a non-zakatable asset. So if the person that paid you the money just a day before, so on your valuation date, you actually receive the money, now there is zakah due on that cash, because you've got to you've got to add up all your zakatable assets, and now cash is included and cash is zakatable. When we're referring to debtors on zakatable assets, so this is where from trade, let's say you purchased, you sold goods, so these are basically debtors on business sales. So if the debtor is, and here we get to the weak or strong, if the debtor is strong, obviously it would be added as part of your zakatable assets. If the debtor is weak, here we're referring to the person is unable to pay for whatever financial reason, then you've got to look, there are actually difference of opinion here. The one opinion says that you do not have to pay zakah for the outstanding debtor until the year that they pay you. You then have to pay for the outstanding, for the 2.5% zakah. The other view is that you don't pay zakah, and once you receive the money, you've actually got to pay for the outstanding years of zakah, which means that you may have all just added in as part of your zakatable assets in the very beginning every single year. So those are just the two views on weak debtors. So zakah on policies. So most conventional policies are impermissible, because we usually use non-Sharia compliant policies, because most conventional is non-Sharia compliant. However, remember, the capital money that you've transferred to that policy that was halal funds will always remain halal. So basically it means that you still need to determine what those capital amounts were, less in terms of between the two. So it's actually the premiums between you paid and the surrender value. Whatever is lesser of the two, you have to pay zakah on that. So say, for example, you've put it into a policy and you've contributed today 10,000 Rand. So that was the premiums. However, the value of the policy, for whatever reason, due to markets changes, it's dropped to 8,000. You will pay on the lesser of the two, so you pay on the 8,000 Rand. On Sharia compliant policies, because it's Sharia compliant, you pay on the value of the policy. So zakah on policies. So most conventional policies are impermissible, because we usually use non-Sharia compliant policies, because most conventional is non-Sharia compliant. However, remember, the capital money that you've transferred to that policy that was halal funds will always remain halal. So basically it means that you still need to determine what those capital amounts were, less in terms of between the two. So it's actually the premiums between you paid and the surrender value. Whatever is lesser of the two, you have to pay zakah on that. So say, for example, you've put it into a policy and you've contributed today 10,000 Rand. So that was the premiums. However, the value of the policy, for whatever reason, due to markets changes, it's dropped to 8,000. You will pay on the lesser of the two, so you pay on the 8,000 Rand. On Sharia compliant policies, because it's Sharia compliant, you pay on the value of the policy. Zakah on retirement savings. So this is a very common question we usually get on zakah relating to retirement savings. So retirement savings is basically you saving for retirement, either through a pension provident fund or through a retirement annuity. When referring to pension provident funds, these are defined benefit plans. These are basically resulting from a condition of employment where you have an obligation to contribute towards a pension or provident fund because you are employed by this company. Because of this condition of employment, the value of this pension or provident fund every single year is not zakatable, because technically all it is, you are receiving a deferred salary when you reach retirement. That's all that it is, which means you technically don't own it. You just have a claim to a value when you reach retirement. The business, the company, they do as they please in terms of investing these funds in these policies. as they wish, which means you can't direct them to any of the funding products. So because of that, you do not technically, you don't own the money that's in these pension and provident funds. You have a claim to it. However, when we're referring to retirement annuities, so these are defined contribution plans, because here you're contributing towards a retirement annuity to determine exactly how much you're going to get at the end. So if, for example, you make a contribution because you may want to receive 10,000 Rand a month. So it's not linked to a salary, for example, it's linked to a contribution that you're making. And because this is a discretionary initiation from your part, in the fact that you're not obligated, you're making this voluntary contribution towards this retirement annuity, knowing full well that it will be locked in, because the same retirement annuities follow the similar rules compared to pension and provident funds. You will not have access to these funds. Irrespective, you will still pay zakah on the net value of these zakatable of these retirement annuity funds every single year. So that's the difference between pension provident funds and retirement annuities. And the main thing is in terms of this compulsory versus voluntary nature. Zakah on gold, silver, and jewelry. So just to be clear, there's no difference of opinion. Zakah is payable on gold, on all gold and silver, irrespective of its form. The only difference of opinion comes in when we're referring to personal jewelry. So let me just maybe take the one madhab that refers to where all gold and silver, irrespective of the personal use, is zakatable. So this is Imam Abu Hanifa has indicated that all gold is zakatable, irrespective why you're holding it. Irrespective if you have personal jewelry, it is zakatable. The other madahib, gold and silver relating to personal jewelry, they are not zakatable, even if you wear it once a year or just for special occasions, because the common question we get is, I don't always wear my personal jewelry. I wear it maybe just once a year or just, attending occasions. These are not zakatable. So just for the Hanafi follower, in terms of how do you calculate your zakah on your jewelry, you only pay zakah on the weight of the gold and silver. The entire piece is not zakatable, because the entire piece may consider of certain stones, etc. It's only the gold that's zakatable. So just take it to a reputable jeweler, they will weigh it and they'll give you the exact grams and carat of gold, and you just pay it, because the rate varies based on the carat of gold. So all you can do is, in fact, we've got a zakah calculator on our website. All you just punch in is the grams and it pushes out the value, because we already have the predetermined rates that's linked to it, that's linked to some sort of system backend. But you only pay on the weight of the gold and silver. Digital assets. So yeah, I thought I'll just quickly, briefly go through some digital assets. So most commonly what people refer to are what we call crypto assets. So this is just an umbrella term for crypto assets. So there are different types of crypto assets, and they are all only on the digital space in terms of nature. However, there are different views when it comes to digital or crypto assets. If you're following the view that digital assets or crypto assets are not zakatable, then what this means is that the return on these assets are not Sharia compliant, which means you actually just have to discharge of them, give it away, etc. And as we mentioned earlier on, there would be no reward for you giving it away. So this is if you're following the view that digital assets or crypto assets are not zakatable. If you're following the view of digital assets being zakatable, then you've got to look at your intention and the type of digital asset. Because remember, the intention will determine whether it's zakatable or not. But if by default the asset is zakatable, then there may not be, then it will be zakatable. So it depends on, for example, the investment strategy of this asset, whether it's trading, because if it's trading, irrespective, it will be zakatable. If you buy and holding, it may not be zakatable. For example, if you're holding if you're holding the asset with the intention of selling it, say for example, the same example used earlier on, if you're buying gold for a longer term, this will obviously now depend what kind of asset, digital asset is it. If the digital asset is zakatable in its nature, like we said, gold, it will be by default zakatable, irrespective of the intention. So let's say, for example, you're holding Bitcoin. So Bitcoin is a digital currency. Your intention may not be to trade with it. Your intention may not be to use it in any way other than just to hold it. So even if your intention is not to sell it or trade with it, Bitcoin in itself is a zakatable asset because it's used, and if you're following obviously the view that digital assets are zakatable, Bitcoin is a medium of exchange. It's similar to money. It's similar to gold and silver, which means you can purchase things with it. In that sense, irrespective of your intention, it will be zakatable. But there are other assets, and I listed some other assets that digital assets that we have. For example, we have cryptocurrency. I just mentioned Bitcoin. So it's basically created as a payment system and as a medium of exchange. And like we said earlier on, this will always be zakatable. We have security tokens. So this just represents shares in multiple companies. So it represents ownership to an underlying asset. And remember, we said that you technically pay on the zakatable assets on the in the assets of the company. So it depends on the underlying assets, and you pay on the proportion that you hold of those underlying zakatable assets. When we look at, for example, governance tokens, so these are just tokens that are generally issued in a way either on a platform for you to have a view or have your say, not technically to trade with, because if you're trading with it, remember, irrespective of why you're holding any digital asset, it would be zakatable, or just not even digital, any asset that you're trading with would be zakatable. So governance, if you're just holding it, then they would not be zakatable because the objective isn't, it's a medium of exchange. You're not trading with it. It's just for holding, for you want to diversify your wealth, for example. These would not be zakatable. Asset-backed token. So this is basically tokenization where you hold a token for a physical asset. So say, for example, you could hold a token in a share in a property. So if you look at the ownership of that, for example, similar to what we mentioned earlier on in terms of the buildings, those are technically not zakatable. So if you're holding a token in a share in a property, that would not be zakatable. What would be zakatable would be the rental income if you're still holding it in your possession on the day of your calculation. So if you're looking at, for example, utility tokens, so this is just basically where a token that provides some benefit, if you're holding it for trade, remember to be zakatable. But if you're just holding it as a means to use a platform to purchase some utility of gas, etc., then it would not be zakatable. Then just lastly, NFTs, which is the non-fungible tokens. This is just a secure blockchain certificate. It entitles you as the owner to a digital asset that has to be, for example, it's got to be unique and it's got to be obviously identifiable. The Sharia compliancy of that, obviously, you've got to look at the underlying asset of which the NFT is linked to. From a zakah perspective, if you're trading with it, it's zakatable. If you purchase it to hold it, and most of these NFTs are like paintings, for example, similar to the one I just mentioned before in the non-zakatable assets. If it's a painting, if it's a personal asset, then you do not pay zakah on it. So always look at the underlying asset that's linked to this NFT. So now we're going to talk just basically or briefly on business assets. So business assets are those liquid and circulating assets. So it's easy, transferable, and it's easy to change it into cash. Similar to what we've mentioned earlier on, cash and cash equivalents, all cash and cash equivalents, foreign currency, everything. You obviously have to just translate it on the day of your valuation date. Those are everything relating to cash and cash equivalents. Obviously, anything that's non-Sharia compliant in terms of equivalent interest, you've got to exclude. Receivables, exactly the same as I've mentioned earlier on. However, from a business perspective, there is a difference of opinion relating to debtors for services. So if you're a doctor, for example, and you've rendered a service and your patients don't necessarily pay on the day, and they normally pay however terms, the Hanafi madhab, so Imam Abu Hanifa is of the view that you do not pay zakah on debtors relating to services. All the other madahib follow the view that, and which is the view that we follow as well, there is zakah due on debtors relating to services. Trade debtors is generally you've got to pay on goods that you sell, and you follow the same principle in terms of the weak versus strong. Stock. So this is obviously you have a business where you're selling a product, and you have various methods of valuing stock. But just to be reminded, stock includes raw materials, finished goods, as well as work in progress. So you've got to add the values of all of them. Just in terms of the various methods, you get the cost and net realizable value, you get the retail value, market value, and then you also get the wholesale value. So the wholesale value is for willing buyer, willing seller in one transaction. So if I had an entire factory of goods, what would be the price that in one transaction somebody would purchase all my stock? So it would neither be cost and neither would it be market value. It's that in-between value. And that's the view, the most practical view that we say that people should follow, because it's usually somewhat easier. But also, whatever view you follow, just be consistent with the view or the method that you're calculating. Don't decide this year I'm going to calculate market value. Next year you're going to decide to calculate a different value. Stick to the value unless obviously you've determined that you've calculated completely incorrectly and you have to redo the calculation. Just in terms of investments, so this is just as we mentioned earlier, a business may own investments in another business. Be reminded that we only pay zakah on those zakatable assets as well, because the investment could include assets that are not zakatable. So just remember, it's those assets that are zakatable, which is generally your cash, debtors, stock. Just in terms of the capital or assets that are not zakatable in a business would be, as I mentioned earlier on, your buildings, your fixtures, your equipment, delivery vehicles, computers, etc. Because it's used in the production of income, they are not zakatable. Then lastly, we're just going to go through, so what are the liabilities that you're allowed to deduct? So most commonly practiced, we allow to deduct, according to Imam Abu Hanifa, are those immediate necessary expenses. The other views, Imam Shafi'i is of the view that you do not, or you are not allowed to deduct any debt, any liabilities. And if you look at the Maliki view, you're only allowed to deduct those debt that's related to zakatable assets. However, what most commonly practiced is what we recommend as well, is that you're allowed to deduct those immediate and necessary expenses like your municipal car, any of those monthly payments that you normally pay, you're allowed to deduct those immediate expenses. So now I'm going to just remind you of the formula, because this is a very important formula that you're going to need to jot down. You have your zakatable assets, which is all your cash, debtors, stock, etc., retirement annuities, gold and silver, less liabilities, which is those immediate and necessary expenses, not, and maybe I should have mentioned it before, not your gym membership fee, not any of those, if you're following any TV program subscriptions, it's only those expenses that are necessary. So less those liabilities equals your net zakatable assets. So now you have your net zakatable assets times your 2.5%, because we're only dealing with liquid assets, and that will give you what your zakah is due on. So that is basically how we've gone through. I don't know if I went too fast with the presentation, which I think would then allow us to then maybe go through questions if there are any questions. to be able to answer them. Assalamu alaikum, jazakumullah khairan. The gold is also a personal asset, but we to pay zakah on. Would you please elaborate? Oh, would you pay zakah on? Obviously, gold, as I've mentioned before, relating to if it's, for example, and this is maybe an important point, if you're receiving gold as a personal asset, and let's a typical example would be a Kruger coin or any coin that's a billion coin that you've kind of that you hold, irrespective of why you're holding it. So you may have even received it as mahar, because currently that's what most or a lot of women nowadays ask for are gold coins. Even if you've received it as mahar, the gold coin in itself is zakatable. So you will have to pay zakah on that every single year. I may elaborate on the question as well, and we always get to ask the question, now what if I'm, for example, I'm at home, I'm a stay-at-home mom, and I have these gold coins, however, I don't have any other wealth, what do I do? So if you own just the gold coins and you own no other wealth, you don't own any investments, no retirement annuities, you don't have cash in the bank because the husband takes care of the family. If you only have gold, then we recommend you use the gold nisab, not the silver nisab. Maulana Ibrahim, I think it was, he went through the nisabs. You have gold and you have silver nisab. We use silver nisab for different reasons, because it's recommended, because it's commonly used in the country. We generally have mixed wealth, and we have gold, silver, cash, debtors, stock, etc. We use it because it has mixed wealth, and because if the silver nisab is much less compared to the gold nisab. If you look at, for example, today in South Africa, the nisab is around about 12,000 rand, because it's based on 612 grams of silver. The silver is very cheap. If you look at gold, and if you look at gold even in the last 2 weeks, how the value of gold has gone up. Gold is around about 120,000 rand. You then have to obviously use your gold nisab, and gold nisab is 87 grams of gold. So what you do is a Kruger coin. I don't know in which country you live in. So let's just assume what you have to do is weigh the gold coin that you have. If it is equal to or more than the 87 grams of gold, then there's a zakah due on that wealth. If it's less than 87 grams of gold, then you haven't reached the nisab as yet, which means there will be no zakah due on it. So that is what I can recommend for the sister who has Kruger, maybe gold coins, and that is only if she has gold coins. If she has cash in the bank, etc., you now have to use the silver nisab. That's what we recommend. Another question we always get is, just to elaborate on the same question, what if, for example, she reaches the nisab, but she doesn't have the funds to pay for the zakah? Firstly, when we have gold, we technically have surplus wealth, which means that we're technically wealthy. You cannot not pay zakah on surplus wealth that you have, because it means that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given you wealth that you need to purify. You technically have to sell your gold coin, or one of them, or something, to be able to pay the zakah on that wealth. That's the first option. If not, the second option you may have is ask your husband to pay zakah on that wealth. He can do that on your behalf. He's not obligated. However, it builds love between spouses. Especially if he's given you that gold as a gift, he would want to pay that zakah for you. But zakah has to be paid on that wealth, whether you pay for it. Preferably, you should pay for it. But if you want to retain the gold, then he can pay for that zakah that's due on that wealth. Either of the two, preferably you, but zakah must be paid on it. What is stock in trade? That's the next question. So stock in trade is, for example, I am in the business of selling computers. That's my business. I sell computers. However, on the day of my zakah valuation, I have some computers still on hand. I haven't sold all of the computers. So the stock that I have on hand is my stock in trade. I then have to determine based on the methods that I'm going to calculate my stock on, and I add that to my other zakatable assets, to the cash, etc. So that is stock in trade. And remember, because if I was a computer business, it would be the computers, it would be all the other add-ons that you would have relating to computers, whether it would be the cords that you purchase. Because sometimes when you come into a computer shop, you don't just buy a computer, you'd buy the back-end things as well. That would all be your stock relating to your business. The next question, please, can you go over the explanation on different treatment of retirement annuities and pension funds? Okay, let me go through that just again, because I know this is a very common question. So these are all just means of saving for retirement. The one condition or the one method is through defined benefit plan. This is either pension or provident fund. That's the only two that is basically defined benefit plans. These are, pension is through a government, provident fund is through a business. This is where, for example, you are obligated. It's mandatory. You're signing an employment contract saying that I, Feroz Mohammed, am employed. Okay, I'm not employed by SANZAF, so I don't want to use that example. I'm employed by what's any company, Feroz and Associates. I'm employed by Feroz and Associates. I will contribute 5% of my salary towards a provident fund, and generally the company, as part of your package, also contributes towards this pension and provident fund. Because you're obligated to make this payment, you cannot say, well, I want to join Feroz and Associates, but I don't want to contribute towards the pension and provident fund. That's usually not the case. It's an obligation. You have to contribute towards this fund. And because of that obligation, because of that mandatory condition that's linked to this contribution, you do not have to pay zakah on the value of this pension fund every single year. With the retirement annuity, say, for example, I'm unemployed. I'm not full-time employed, but I want to also save towards retirement. I have to take out a retirement annuity. I have to take out a contribution plan, defined contribution plan. And because of that, I'm making the voluntary decision. I'm deciding to rather putting it away, investing it in this RA, as opposed to putting it in the bank or putting it in investment or starting a business. That decision of locking it in does not prevent you from now making this asset not zakatable because you don't have access to it. Because what happens is that you still have authority over this fund. You tell your broker, please invest it in a Sharia compliant investment, whether it's equity, whether it's property, etc. You are able to do that. That allows you some authority over this retirement annuity, and you've also made that discretionary decision. Because of that, you will pay the zakah on that, not you will, but zakah is due on that wealth every single year, less the taxes that you would have had to pay. So if I had to withdraw or had access to these funds now, and I would have to pay taxes on it, it would be net of those taxes, and that value would be zakatable. So that's how retirement annuities and provident funds work. I could elaborate on this question even further. So say, for example, you're in between employment. So I'm resigned from my job. So now they give me access to certain portions of my pension or provident fund. Because that's, I don't know how it works in other countries, but generally that's how it works here. You have access to a certain amount of funds. You can either take that money, put it in your bank account and do with it as you please, or you can hold it in a different fund. I'm trying to think what's the word. We hold it in a, I can't get to the word. Allahumma salli ala Sayyidina Muhammad. You hold it in preservation, sorry. You hold it in a preservation fund. And obviously through the preservation, you put it into pension. The fact that you had, so only the element that is zakat, that was zakatable, because remember, you had access to it. So only that portion, so let's say the fund was worth 2 million. You had a portion of 100,000, but you decided you don't want to access the funds. You rather just want to keep it, and you've held it in a preservation fund to move it into a pension fund again. That 100,000 rand that you had access to, zakah would then be liable on that 100,000 until you have access to it, until you reach retirement. So remember, you had access to it, you put it back into the fund again, and for it to continue until you start a new employment and they started a new pension fund, you put it all into another pension fund, preservation pension fund, and it will stay there until you reach retirement. That 100,000 rand, less taxes would be zakatable every single year. Another question we also get, sorry, I just want to elaborate on this because it refers to the pension and provident fund. So let's say, for example, I am employed at Pharaohs and Associates and Company. The compulsory contribution I have to make is 5%. However, I have more disposable income. I want to put in 7%. What is compulsory is the 5%. I added the additional 2%, so now my contribution is 7%. What is not zakatable would be the 5%, but what will be zakatable is the 2%, because that was my discretion. I voluntarily decided to contribute the additional 2%. So you've got to then determine what is that 2% contribution related in terms of the value of that fund, and you will have to pay zakah on that every single year. I hope I've elaborated a lot on the pension and provident fund and RAs. The next question, Sister Feroz, please could you confirm if the presentation will be shared? Yes, as Brother Akhsan mentioned last week, the presentation, after you've attended all the 5 sessions, you'll then receive all the presentations at the same time. What about zakah and sukuk? So sukuk is, it's not technically what we call a government bond, because obviously government bonds are linked to interest. Sukuk is you're holding a value to a fixed percentage share, a fixed contribution in what we call a bond. So that's what just a sukuk is, but an underlying asset. So if it is something that you haven't received, so for example, if you've invested it in a sukuk and remember, sukuk is like a government bond. That value of that bond is like an investment. You've put it into the sukuk, and as long as the sukuk still exists, even though it's maybe a 2-year sukuk, you will still pay zakah on the value of that, because it's very similar in the sense that the way it's treated as a government bond, but it's not the same thing because it's linked to a asset, which makes it Sharia compliant. If you're receiving any payouts, so according to similar to government bonds, you may receive every 6 monthly a repayment. If you obviously take out the repayment and it obviously gets distributed by default, if that money is part of your bank account, you will pay zakah on it if it's still in your possession on the day of your zakah calculation date. How can a business optimize its cash flow and financial planning to ensure timely and accurate zakah payments while maximizing growth and social impact? So when it comes to zakah payments relating to a business, remember, zakah, there is a view that zakah can be paid by a business as long as all the shareholding of that business gives permission that zakah can be deducted from that wealth. Remember, zakah is due on people only. So it's your wealth that's in that business. Either you can do it 2 ways. You can either, because there's a view that zakah is due on business regarded as a separate entity or a person as a separate entity. So you can either take out your share from the business and pay it and calculate it as a personal individual, or in the business, you can do the calculation and it can be paid through the business, but it would be for the shareholding, because business in itself doesn't necessarily pay zakah. So that is how we would do it from a zakah calculation perspective. From a planning perspective, I think you can do it similar to like you would with budgeting, because obviously if the entity is regarded as a zakah entity to pay zakah, then I suppose you can do it as the same planning budgeting you would for any other expense. But remember, it would directly come through the shareholding. So that's how zakah can be calculated through business or through an individual. Please add me to the group where I can get access to this audio and material. Okay, that's for Brother Ahsan. When you say the net retirement annuity amount, how do we determine the net amount? So the net amount is net of taxes. So I'm going to give an example. For example, in South Africa, if you had to have a payout, if you get a payout, government would want to have the share. They're going to tax you. So it would be less those taxes, any tax that you would have to pay, because if you receive the money, it would be net of any of those taxes in any case. So that's what we say, net of taxes. Determine what it is. You can ask your broker what the taxes would be, and you'll then be able to calculate it. So that is that question. These shahadahs can be shared. Yes, it will, inshallah. Please can we count the monthly upkeep given to some extended family as part of the liabilities? From my understanding, for example, a monthly upkeep given to extended family as part of liabilities. So if you're doing your zakah calculation and also remember, who's extended family, obviously can't be your wife, it can't be your parents or your grandparents, it can't be your children, it can't be your great-grandchildren. Anything in your lineage that is directly descendant or descendant cannot receive your zakah. So obviously you can't deduct it. Extended family would be siblings, aunts, uncles, etc. So when you're doing your calculation, part payment of liabilities related to that. So technically, you're only allowed to deduct that portion that's immediate. Similar to, for example, if you have a bond, your bond, you cannot allow to deduct your 12 months installment that's due. You're only allowed to deduct the 1 month that's due, immediate month, not the 12 months. So if you're contributing towards a family, so that family expenditure would all obviously form part of your monthly expenditure. So that would form part of it every single month. So you'd only be allowed to deduct that 1 month's contribution that you would have made, upkeep of that family. Assalamu alaikum wa barakatuh. Is zakah payable on inheritance? So the view of most scholars is that if the inheritance has not been received as yet, for example, the estate hasn't been wound up, sometimes it can take years, 2-3 years for an estate to wind up. If they haven't distributed that wealth as yet, which means it's still being wound up by the master's office, then there is no zakah due on it because you have to be the owner of that wealth. And technically, you're not the owner as yet. So you do not pay zakah on it if it hasn't been wound up. If the estate has been wound up and you've received your inheritance, even if you received your inheritance 3 months before your zakah valuation date, I gave it in the example where we did the whole elaboration. Say, for example, you received 100,000 3 months just before your zakah valuation date, because it's of the same wealth, because it's liquid assets, whether it's cash, debtors, stock, etc. You will pay zakah on inheritance if it's in your possession on your anniversary, zakah anniversary date. So it's not the inheritance that needs to be held for one Islamic calendar year, like we said earlier, it's the nisab. If you've never held nisab before, so this is where the example may change. So let's say I've received inheritance today and I've never paid zakah before. What happens now is today is your anniversary date. So you document today's date. What now happens is next year this time, whatever you have left of your inheritance and all your other zakatable assets, you've may purchase some investments, you have some money in the cash in the bank, you may have bought a business, those zakatable assets, whatever of the inheritance you have left, you have maybe have taken your parents or all your children on Umrah, you have bought a residential home, whatever you have left in your possession on the day of your calculation, that is what's zakatable. Zakah is due on wealth that you have in your possession on the day of your valuation date. So zakah is almost like a balance sheet approach. It's not on income, it's not on earnings. Irrespective of what you earn during the year, if you've spent the money, if you've purchased anything, obviously if you purchase a zakatable asset, then that would by default be added as part of your wealth. If you've used money, subhanAllah, Allah's most merciful, if you've given it as sadaqah, if you don't have it, you don't pay zakah on it. But if you've, whatever you have left of your inheritance, if you never paid zakah before, then that is what you pay on, including other zakatable assets, times 2.5%. So I hope I've clarified the inheritance question. Is everything intended for sale zakatable? Yes. Whatever you intend for trade to sell is zakatable. Obviously, only Sharia products. If you're intending to sell any products in the manufacturing and the production of anything that's unlawful, then it's obviously excluded from zakah. But if you're selling anything, it's zakatable, the value of those products. I seem to miss the point where you spoke on zakah on pension schemes. Okay, I think maybe you want to watch the recording, because I think I've elaborated it quite intensively for you to be able to just catch on the answer. Regarding investments, you calculate zakah on the total investment amount, including growth for the year, and how does taxes affect this calculation? So, yes, so irrespective of the growth. So, I've heard somebody says, well, you only pay on the growth. Zakah, always remember, zakah is paid on wealth that you have in your possession or what you own, because physically you don't necessarily hold the investment. It's obviously held with an agent. So whatever you own on the day of your anniversary is zakatable. Whether it grew by 2%, whether it grew by 15%, the value of that investment is zakatable, not just the return. Everything is zakatable, which means everything's in need of purification. That would be zakatable. And how does taxes affect this calculation? Well, it depends on which country, because sometimes if you had to discharge of that, like if you had to take out that investment, there may be capital gains tax, for example. Surely the government taxes would apply. It would be net of those taxes. Okay. If I'm a mentally ill person, owns gold, are they responsible to pay over zakah, or are they exempt to pay zakah? Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. So usually there are 3 individuals of which what we normally say the pen is lifted, for which there is no sin on. The one who sleeps until he awakens, the child that is a minor until he becomes baligh or reaches puberty, and the person that's insane until he reaches sanity. So that is the following of Imam Abu Hanifa, that you do not pay zakah on these individuals. However, Imam Shafi is of the view that everybody is in need of purification, whether you are minor or whether you are insane, I won't say insane, sorry, mentally ill, you pay zakah on your wealth, because all individuals and wealth is in need of purification. So if you're a minor, if you sleep until you awaken, and if you're mentally ill, from Imam Abu Hanifa, there is no zakah due on your wealth. But Imam Shafi'i, all individuals are in need of purification, thus there would be zakah due on those individuals. Remember, if they can't, then the guardian of that person would have to calculate that zakah and discharge or fulfill that obligation. Can you elaborate more on life insurance policies, provident funds, etc., digital assets? I think it'd be easy for you to maybe just watch the presentation. However, maybe on life policies, remember, generally life policies are not zakatable. However, there is a view that says that if you have a life policy and the life policy is surrendered, which means the beneficiary is your estate, then this is more from a Sharia perspective. There is generally, what a life policy is like an insurance. It's covering a risk. You're paying a contribution for the potential or for something that may happen, an event that may happen. So what you're doing is you're paying an expense, but there's no benefit for you at the end. And unless it's if you look at sometimes short-term insurance, if there's a benefit for you. So if you're receiving what we call paybacks, if you don't claim, you get a payback. Only once you receive the payback, then obviously when it's in your money, in your bank account, it's formed parts of cash, and cash is a zakatable asset. But if you're paying towards short-term insurance, then there is no zakah due on it, because there's no benefit for you. It's covering a risk of a potential event that's happening. For example, motor vehicle insurance. You're paying motor vehicle insurance. If nothing happens to your car, you lose the money. It's just covering a risk. So there isn't any benefit for you when it comes to short-term insurance. If there's life insurance and it is Sharia compliant, if there is a value in it for you, for example, there may be termination value or surrender value, and it is at today's value, then that would be zakatable, because then it would be yours technically. But if it's something that there are conditions attached to it, always make sure or consider the fact that, is this technically mine? Can I withdraw this money? Will I be able to give it away, discharge of it, gift it? If the answer to it is no, then you may have to question ownership. But if the answer is yes, I can actually just withdraw the money right now and do something with it, then that would be a possibility of zakah being due to it, because it belongs to you. Whether it's halal or not halal, you've got to consider that. Look at the contributions that you've made, because as we mentioned before, the capital will always remain zakatable. Whatever funds you're putting in a non-Sharia product, the capital will always remain zakatable. You now have to determine what is Sharia portion of it is zakatable, and what of the non-Sharia portion you've got to exclude from that value of that fund. If I were to put my assets and liabilities and income and expenses on a conventional financial statements format, then take out the no zakatable assets and liabilities, can I then pay my zakah on my net worth? Jazakumullah khairan. So if I put my assets and liabilities and income and expenses, okay, firstly, zakah is not due on income and expenses statement approach. Remember we said zakah is balance sheet approach. Zakah is not calculated on what you've earned and what you've expensed during the year. If the money is gone, the money is gone. If you have the money, it would be in a form of an asset. You now have to determine what are these assets and are they zakatable. That's basically the approach that you have to take. And if it's in your personal capacity, you add all your personal assets, and from a business, you'd add your business assets, and then you can do the calculation together. You add your zakatable business assets, and then you get the total times 2.5%, and that's your zakah liability. I hope I answered that question clearly. Please can you share the slides? Yes, it will. My network has not been good. Okay, so I missed a lot of the presentation. Okay, I have a cash balance equivalent to $35,000 that I used to start a business by end of whichever year. Made a loss by about 18,000. I have to pay zakah on the remaining cash. So when we look at a balance sheet, so this is obviously from a business perspective. Brother Shaukat Muqaddam is going to do the calculation going into practical examples of a business. But just very briefly, just to answer Brother Muhammad, when we're looking at a balance sheet, first of all, the zakatable assets in a balance sheet has slightly a different rate in that it's 2.577%. So it's not a 2.5 because of the Gregorian calendar, because usually businesses uses the Gregorian calendar date, not the Islamic date. Just look at, for example, if you're looking at a balance sheet, you have the different assets, you have equity and you have liabilities. Equity, remember, equity is money that you've put into the business. So that there is no calculation on that because it's not technically wealth that you have. You have a share in a business, which the money is being used. Either it's gone through cash or through some sort of asset. So equity, you got to exclude. Losses, because losses is it's an entry from an accounting perspective. Zakah is only due on wealth on surplus wealth. So it would be on cash. So if you have profits, if you've made profits, it would have gone to the bank account. Like I said, losses is just an item, an accounting which you can deduct further profits from. So I've mentioned in terms of you put in money in, so capital wouldn't be zakatable. The loss you don't account for. You now have to determine what other zakatable assets do you still have in the business. So if you have cash, yes, cash is a zakatable asset. So whatever is the remaining cash, what stock you have on the date of your anniversary or the date of doing your balance sheet. If you have any debtors, that would be included as well. So any other assets that would be zakatable, you've got to do that calculation and 2.5% on that. Alhamdulillah, the brother is from Ghana. Next question, there are companies that operate internal provident funds in addition to the compulsory provident funds with similar conditions are such zakatable. So if it isn't compulsory in nature, which means you are now, like I mentioned earlier, the difference between the 5% and you wanted to contribute 2%, so it makes it 7%. If you voluntarily contributing towards a provident fund which is not compulsory, then that would be zakatable, because you're making that decision on a voluntary basis to lock your money in. And that would be zakatable. Same rules apply. You've got to get the value every single year and net of any taxes. Fatima, Assalamu alaikum, Sister Fatima. Do I pay zakah on capital relating to policies? That's a condition of my employment. Life assurance, funeral, medical aid. So remember, these are not assets in the sense that these are contributions that, for example, companies would make to cover a risk. So this is not something that you would benefit at the end of the day. So if you look at, for example, if you work at a company, they would somehow cover your life because you are an important individual, you're key a stakeholder or key person to this business. They would then cover your life, because if anything happens to you, Allah forbid, the company may shut down because you may have all the intellectual property in your brain and you haven't, documented anything. These are just expenses. So this is not your assets that you that belongs to you, for example. So that wouldn't be zakatable in your hands. Is it permissible in a community to have different zakah and nisab thresholds, one of gold, one of silver, bearing in mind that silver nisab threshold broadens and widens zakah payers? Yes, that's one of the reasons why we use silver, because it broadens, and I did mention it when I spoke earlier on in terms of why we use silver. The other reason why we use silver is that the contribution or the threshold for the nisab of silver is much lesser compared to the one for gold. And because of that, more individuals would contribute to this pillar and would widen the pool of zakah, which means more individuals can be benefiting from zakah. Can you have different thresholds? Technically, we use the nisab that is used most commonly in the country. So, for example, in South Africa, we use the nisab of silver. However, I cannot tell you not to use gold. If you want to use gold because you feel that that is a nisab you want to use, then that is what you can. But this, there are, and because we're not regulated in this particular country, because South Africa, we minority, we're not regulated, so hence you may use gold, but generally we use silver. However, obviously, if you're a regulated country, I think they directly take the money from your bank account, which they already have predetermined the threshold to be silver, and they will just take the money from your account. However, nothing precludes you from taking gold because both are correct. Please, could you elaborate on the business model, trading versus holding? I understand these from an accounting perspective. Okay, I'm going to try and understand in terms. Okay, let's use an property asset. I think that would be because I can give it both from a holding and from a trading perspective. If I am an individual or even a business, and I'm buying a property, I'm purchasing a property to hold. I'm not trading with it, which means I'm not in the business of development or construction of property. I'm just holding this asset because it's a good investment. I can diversify. I can appreciate the value in this. My intention may be to sell it, let's say, in 10 years' time, but that's not I'm not trading in it. For that capital asset, it is not zakatable. What may be zakatable would be the net rental income. If it's in my bank account, because I would then have it in my bank account on the day of my valuation. But if I've spent it, it's gone. There would be no zakat due on it. So for capital assets like a property, a building, not trading with it, so you're holding it as an investment, long-term investment, the value of that property would not be zakatable. As a construction company, so if I'm in the business of building properties or in developing units, now I'm trading with it. I'm buying and I'm selling. Or I refurbish this property and I sell it. I buy another property, I refurbish it and I sell it. Now you're in the business of selling or trading with property. That is now zakatable assets. So you see the difference between the two. I hope I've clarified that. How do you calculate zakah on salary earners? So there is no zakah due on salary that you earn. If you're calculating salary, because some people have the view that they calculate zakah on salary that they're earning. If you're calculating on the salary that you're earning, And you then calculate zakah on the cash that you're holding. Because remember, cash is a zakatable asset. You're then going to double count. You're going to be duplicating zakah. That's why we say it's easier. Remove the earnings. Base it on the balance sheet approach. Whatever cash you have in your bank account, because everything would go through your bank account. Your salary goes through your bank account. The expenses goes out of your bank account. What you have left is accountable. You don't have to now go and determine, I earned 10,000, I deducted or I paid for all the expenses. What I'm left with is 2,000. If 2,000 is in the bank account and forms part of your other assets, that is what you pay on. So pay on what you hold on the day of your valuation date. How are we with time? Okay, it's 17 minutes past. The Adhan is going to go off at about just after past. If personal assets is among non-zakatable asset classes, but it's all fixed assets that you listed above. If personal assets is among non-zakatable assets. Okay, but it's all fixed assets. So if you look at fixed assets so let's look at one asset that could be both the two. So you have vehicles, but you have a vehicle that you drive with, which is your personal car, and then you have your business vehicles. But they're all added together, is that I assume you're indicating. The one that's not zakatable, you've got to exclude. You can remove that value of that non-zakatable vehicle. So let's say the total is 100,000 and that one is worth 20,000. You can remove the 20 and the rest of it would be zakatable, and that would be 80,000. If I can give it to you in the most simplest way. You just remove what's not zakatable because it's a personal asset. You use it in your personal capacity. As a government employee upon retirement receiving a lump sum, a zakah due immediately or only after the year. I've explained this in the pension retirement question, so I don't know if I need to repeat that. Obviously, if you haven't paid zakah before, you then have to wait for 1 year. That would be your anniversary date, and you wait for 1 year. If you pay zakah every single year, now you're receiving a lump sum, and 2 months later is your zakah valuation date. Whatever you have in your ownership would be zakatable, including the lump sum. Okay. If you've discharged some of it, it's gone. Whatever you have left, that would be zakatable. Zakah on digital assets like Bitcoin and the likes, how can it be paid? And how can one know the value either in gold or silver? Is it going to be paid using digital currency? Sure, a lot of questions. Okay, so let's answer the first one. Zakah on digital assets like Bitcoin and likes, how can it be paid? Zakah can be paid in any class of the assets. It doesn't mean that because you have Bitcoin, and obviously you're of the view that Bitcoin is zakatable, it doesn't mean you've got a discharge of your zakah from Bitcoin, of Bitcoin. It doesn't mean that you have stock, that you've got a discharge of your zakah of the stock that you have. You add up all your assets, the values would obviously be all listed. You times it by 2.5%. And if you have whatever you have in your means, whether you want to discharge it with cash, you can discharge it with cash. If you have stock and you want to discharge it in kind, you can discharge it in kind as well, because a lot of business people normally want to discharge their zakah in kind. But just bearing in mind, if it's in kind, you've got to meet the need of the individual, make sure it's of a quality that you want to receive as well. So just make sure from the in kind that you meet those conditions. Because if you're in a construction company and you have, and this is always a very typical example we use, and you have bricks, the need of the person is food. You can't give your bricks to somebody that needs food. Match the need to the need of the beneficiary. But you can discharge your zakah in any of the classes of that category, whether you want to discharge it in cash or in Bitcoin. And how can one know the value either in gold or silver? Well, you've got to weigh the gold. You only weigh it once. So if you have, for example, jewelry, or if you have, usually in South Africa, we have a Kruger coin. So the Kruger coin weighs around about 33 grams. You don't have to weigh the coin every single year because the coin the weight won't change. So you just have to document the weight. We have a calculator on our app that lists all the classes of assets. Oops, sorry. I have my son calling me and it appeared on my screen. Sorry. Clearly he's not getting the picture that mom's busy. You put the weight in the calculator. So we have the various carats. We may have 22 carat, we have 18 carat, whatever the carats are. You put in the grams, and we already have the rates in there because the rate of gold changes. It's gone up quite a bit. So the rate of gold changes and it pushes up the value. That's how you can get the value. But you can just Google, what the rate of gold is, times it by but it will be the rate of the carat, because each carat has a different rate. So that's how you can determine the value of the gold. And silver is exactly the same. Is it going to be paid using digital currency? Well, if you have digital currency and there is a means of discharging it, because remember, someone must take ownership of it. So if I don't, for example, have a means of receiving your digital currency, you won't be able to discharge it to me because I wouldn't be able to become the owner of it. How am I going to get it? So you must be able to discharge it to an individual, an organization that accepts digital currency. Is the calculated contributions only to an investment or an RA, or is it calculated on contributions plus growth? I think I've answered this question before. So it would be the value of your investment on your zakah anniversary date, not just the capital, and not just the return. It's the value of your investment plus RA or RA on your anniversary date. So it would always include growth as well. Can zakah be given to a struggling family member, and how can we ensure it aligns with the principles of zakah eligibility without conflicting with the financial responsibilities, family financial responsibilities? This is a very good question, because we always say charity begins at home, and you'll be actually fulfilling two, like we say, killing two birds with one stone, and benefiting twice, because you'll be benefiting in terms of distribution of fulfilling your zakah, but also in terms of kinship, in terms of family. So always try and seek family members that are in need of your zakah. If you obviously know, or there's a program that you want to contribute towards from an organization perspective, that's a very good program. However, always seek family members first. So if you're contributing towards a family member, remember, you don't have to tell the person that you're giving zakah. But what you have to do is you have to do some sort of assessment of eligibility. You can somehow see if you know the family, if it's a family friend, etc. And remember, family, we said specifically, you are not allowed to give, or those who are not eligible to receive zakah are your ascendants and descendants, and your wife, because she's not your family from a lineage point of view, but you are meant to take care of her. She's your responsibility. So other families would be your sisters, nieces, brothers, sisters, aunts, etc. So those family members are entitled to receive, as long as they're eligible. So you can do that eligibility test by doing some sort of inquiry, because not by default somebody would be zakatable. So if I'm a pensioner, I'm not by default eligible, because I may be a pensioner, but I may have received a lump sum from my company or my husband's business company, etc. So you've got to make sure that you do some sort of inquiry about the eligibility of the individual. If you're not sure, so you try to find out, but you're still not sure, then we recommend you actually tell the person that you're giving zakah. If the person is Allah conscious, they will tell you, sorry, I can't receive the zakah because I'm not eligible to receive. But if you've told the person they're receiving zakah and you did some sort of inquiry to the best that you can, then it would be fulfilled. So that's how we recommend you discharging your zakah to a family. But if you know the family is struggling, because you know the family, familiar with their financial condition, as long as they're not the ones that are not eligible to receive, then by all means, you can discharge your zakah. I want to know if the meeting of diamond not zakatable means that no amount of it will make it due for zakah. So zakah is not due on those metals and those stones not specifically mentioned by the Prophet ﷺ, like platinum, palladium, even though if you look at it, it's more valued, higher valued than gold. Platinum is it's a higher value than gold. It's still not zakatable. That's the majority of the view. I'm not sure, I've not heard of any view where they say there may be a capping in terms of jewelry that you could possibly, because in certain Muslim countries, they put a cap on personal jewelry that you need, that you can hold. because some people may, as an intention in terms of trying to manipulate the system or trying to not pay zakah, khila, that want to try and, prevent paying zakah, they would buy personal jewelry. In Muslim countries, they cap it. If you own any personal jewelry more than the value of, let's say, $50,000, you'll pay zakah on it. But that's not in most countries. But there could be a cap. And if it's anything beyond that, if that's what the country has regulated, then there will be zakah due on it. But there's no zakah due on stones like diamonds or gems, etc., even though it is of high value. So yes, no zakah would be due on it. I think I've just answered the next question, which says, what about gems and precious stones? So but remember, if you're trading with it, that's different. If you trade with anything that's halal, there's zakah due on it. So this is just in terms of of the asset in its nature that you would want to hold. I'm Ugandan, but I currently work in the UK. My primary home is in Uganda, and that is where I spend most of my money. In which currency should I pay or compute my nisab? So when we're doing calculations of zakah, generally in terms of ulama, in terms of scholars, where you pay zakah is where you distribute it. So if you're collecting zakah, you distribute it in the same country. But if you're looking at certain wealth that you own, so if your primary home is in Uganda, it wouldn't matter actually where your primary home is, because it's not zakatable. It's a non-zakatable asset. Even if you have two primary homes, so let's say when you're in Uganda half of the year, you live there, and when you're in the UK, you live in the UK. Both of them wouldn't be zakatable because both of them are your primary homes. You may have other family living in there, or it may just be empty. Or in the UK, if you're renting out part of it, then obviously the rental income that you'd have be in your bank account through the cash that you'd receive would be zakatable, the net rental. So that is so it doesn't matter where your primary home is. It wouldn't be zakatable in the first place. But when we speak about zakah, where you collect zakah is where you generally have to distribute it, unless there's some calamity, like an earthquake or something. Then we normally just recommend, people may give the zakah to that country. Okay. But if, for example, you're working in the UK, that is where you're currently living, you distribute it. Because remember, the production of the assets or wealth is in the UK. It's not in Uganda. But if you have family that is in Uganda, you're allowed to send your money to, because that's what people also recommend. Remember I told you about kinship and the reward of taking care of your family first. There is nothing wrong in you sending it to your immediate family, not immediate, but the family that you're allowed to give to take care of their needs if they are eligible to receive zakah. Such a comprehensive presentation. Alhamdulillah, my question is, how about salary? Is it zakatable? No, and if I need to repeat this, there is no zakah due on earnings. So whether you earn dividends, whether you earn a salary, it's on a balance sheet approach. Whatever you own, whatever wealth you own on the day of your anniversary, you do your calculation based on that, irrespective, because you may have earned, let's say, 200,000 during the year. And when it comes to your zakah valuation date, you only managed to save 3,000 Rand or $3,000. If it is equal to above the nisab, then you may be liable to pay zakah. If it's less, then no zakah is due on your wealth, even if you've earned 200,000. So it doesn't matter what you earn, it's what you have in your possession. If one invests in growth preservation funds, okay, I don't know if I'm going to give investment advice here, where income generators is reinvested back, when will zakah be liable? Either when one withdraw, okay, so this is just where you're allowed to withdraw, but you reinvest it. So anything, remember, preservation funds, if it's a preservation fund, you would have had access to it in the first place. So even though you didn't take it out and you kept it in the preservation fund, it would be zakatable. So the growth on that would also be zakatable. But the other part of it would not be, because that would have been locked in. So it's generally 2/3. 1/3 the government usually gives you, 2/3 they usually lock in for retirement. If that preservation fund grows, that element that you would have had access to, if it grows and it gets reinvested, the entire value of that reinvested amount is zakatable. If a farmer farming his own consumption are different from the one who farmed to do the businesses, it's necessary for him to pay zakah at the end. Let's just repeat this question. If the farmer is farming for his own consumption, okay, so he's, no. Obviously, if it's farming for your own consumption, which means you're going to eat from it, etc., then that's not zakatable. Business is different. So business would be part of your stock, etc., so that would be zakatable. Please, are we going to have the slides? Yes, you are. Sorry, I joined late. Has been addressed. I need elaborate on presentation. Okay, you can just watch the presentation, inshallah. Is zakat payable on liquid assets held in a family trust? Okay, so trusts are a bit different. And I don't know if I should mention it because, okay, no, that's a different zakah webinar I'm talking about. That's for next week, zakah in focus. So let me speak about trusts. So generally what trusts are, so people create or form a trust so that the wealth continues. Because if you die, obviously, the wealth has to be distributed. But if it's in a trust, so people generally form trusts, usually an individual to be able to protect assets for the benefit of beneficiaries. When it comes to zakah relating to trusts, remember zakah is due by individuals. If the wealth is in a trust and it's a discretionary trust, which means by the discretion of the trustees, they will determine whether you can receive a distribution or not. If you haven't received the distribution, you don't own that wealth. It is in the trust. When you have a invested right to the trust, to the asset, then that's different because you may have access to that asset as you please. So let's say, for example, who then pays the zakah? Is it the trust or is it the beneficiaries? You have to look at who actually controls these trusts. I know a trust is meant to be formed. However, you're not meant to have control over these trusts, over these assets. That's why you create a trust. However, the underlying person who controls the trust, which is generally the person that formed the trust, it becomes your responsibility to pay zakah on the zakatable assets of this trust. What we do now is in a trust deed, we generally include a clause now to say that zakah is liable or is due on these zakatable assets that the trust holds, which means then the trust will calculate the zakah and distribute the zakah on the zakatable assets. It just prevents the confusion and complication when it gets transferred to the beneficiaries, etc. So if it's a discretionary trust, you have no right over these trusts and you do not pay zakah on it unless they've made a distribution. But we usually recommend the one who formed the trust to pay zakah on the zakatable assets of these trusts every single year. Okay, so what I'll do is then, there aren't too many questions. I think there's just about 3 questions. Okay, there's only one question, which is actually the inventories. You can actually just follow the slides, previous slides in the recording. I've mentioned the valuation and the different methods of inventories. You can just look at that, and that should be able to answer your question, inshallah. Otherwise, I think that's it from me. I trust the presentation was beneficial. If you have any more questions, you may forward it. I don't know, Brother Ahsan will tell you how you can forward any further questions, and we'll answer that later, inshallah. From my side, wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.